Assessment methods are a very important part of SVQ or vocational qualification. If you think about it, with an SVQ or vocational qualification, essentially you're building a portfolio of evidence that proves that you're competent at your job, at your role, and assessment methods are the ways in which we'll go about gathering that evidence to prove that. These are the methods that we're going to use to put evidence together and create that portfolio. So it's important that you understand what the different types of evidence are, where they come from, how to put them together, and what they're all about essentially. So let's start from the beginning and look at what makes up a modern apprenticeship or an SVQ. So all SVQs contain a number of key components. No matter what the name of the qualification is, they've all got the same components. So you've got the modern apprenticeship, which contains three elements. The first element is your SVQ or your CBQ framework, and that is subdivided into mandatory units and optional units. For completing this component of the SVQ or the CBQ, you'll get a certificate from the warden body. So these are organisations such as the SQA, Sitting Guilds, or EAL, to name a few. You've also got enhancement units. Enhancement units typically are an additional unit from another framework other than the framework which you are completing. Well, this may vary from qualification to qualification. And the third component is your core or career skills. So if your SVQ that you're completing is at SCQF level 6 or below, you'll be doing core skills. If it's above SCQF level 6, then you'll be completing career skills as part of that third component. So those are the three components that make up it. Now if we look into that first component in a little bit more detail, to a certain extent, because your enhancement unit's going to probably be an additional unit, you'll also get units, so that's what we're talking about here will still apply. And your career skills and core skills. Career skills look just like ordinary units. Core skills look a bit different, but they still have performance points which you need to cover, just like ordinary units. But if we start by looking at that SVQ framework, that first component, all qualifications will have a framework. Now for this we're using the example of the Business Administration SCQF Level 6 framework, just as an example to show you here. So each SVQ will have a framework which will outline mandatory units which you must complete, and then they'll give you a list of optional units which you can choose from, and there are certain rules about the number of units or the number of credits which you need to complete to get that component. So within the framework there's these units. So if we now take it a step further into this qualification and we have a look at the unit, you'll see that each unit is divided into outcomes, performance criteria, and knowledge and understanding points. So let's take this one step at a time. You'll see that unit guide will all have the unit code up the top, have the name of the unit, and it'll have a description. So for this example we're using the unit Specialist Software 3 just to have a look at. You'll see that the performance criteria is split into outcomes. Now this isn't the case for all units. Some units, particularly within business administration, don't have them split into units, but most units will have. You're not looking to gather evidence that you're competent at doing that outcome per se. You're looking to cover the performance points and the knowledge and understanding points, not the outcomes. However, it can be useful to aim your evidence towards these outcomes, because you'll tend to find if you do, you'll hit these little points if you cover this main outcome in your performance. So you can see here the first outcome for this unit is use a spreadsheet to enter, edit and organise numerical and other data, and that is split into 3 points. So that's subdivided into 3 points. You get point 1, enter and edit numerical and other data accurately. Point 2, combine and link data from different sources, and point 3, store and retrieve spreadsheet files effectively in line with local guidelines and conventions where available. So those are the performance points. So these are 3 points which, if you're doing this unit, you must be able to demonstrate that you're competent at being able to perform those tasks in the workplace. You also have knowledge and understanding. So knowledge and understanding tests your exactly that, knowledge and understanding of key theories which are related, or key concepts which are related to the unit. And for this first outcome, the knowledge and understanding point is identify what numerical and other information is needed in the spreadsheet and how it should be structured. So you can see there each unit split into performance points, knowledge and understanding points as well. Okay, now that's quite important to understand because they are a bit different, and the evidence which assessment methods which you use to gather the evidence for these points are going to be different to reflect that. So we move on now to look at that and the sorts of assessment methods that there are and the differences between knowledge and understanding. So to explain the difference between performance and knowledge and understanding, performance is about how you actually perform the task in the workplace. So it's more so about the how. How do you perform that in the workplace? How do you actually go about doing it and evidencing that? Knowledge and understanding is your understanding and knowledge of key concepts. So that's more about the why. Why is it you're doing that? What's the reason you're doing that? How does it impact? What are the key procedures which you must follow? So you need to know these key procedures before you can start to actually perform them in the workplace. So that's how knowledge and understanding sort of relates to one another. Now, the key thing when it comes to knowledge and understanding within a vocational qualification is that all knowledge and understanding must take place within the context of your work. So you're wanting to relate any knowledge and understanding work that you do to your organisation, your job role that you're doing. So you don't want it to be, you could do this, you might do that, this is something that could be done. You want to be making it the stuff that you're doing in your role. So let's have a look at the sort of assessment methods which we can use for performance criteria first of all. See here we've got observation. So observation is where an assessor will observe the learner completing a task in the workplace. We've got product evidence, so that is for any sort of business qualification, IT qualification. That's typically going to be some sort of document, file, screenshot, some sort of physical evidence that you've been able to perform a task. We've also got personal reflective statements. Personal reflective statements is a story of a time which you've completed a task in the workplace. We've got professional discussions. Professional discussions are audio recorded discussions between an assessor and a learner, where the learner is discussing key concepts, key tasks that they've completed, explain the reason behind things or adding additional context to evidence. We've got witness testimony. So this is where a line manager or a mentor who is experienced and competent in their role is able to testify that they have seen a learner perform particular skills within the workplace. You'll notice here as well that personal reflective statements and professional discussions can be used to evidence knowledge and understanding. Now, technically speaking, all forms of assessment methods here can evidence knowledge and understanding, but it's a bit difficult to infer knowledge and understanding from observing. So if I, for example, am watching a learner complete a task in the workplace, I can't really get from them actually doing it that they really know what the procedures are unless I actually ask them what the procedures are, and then they can say, right, okay, they know what that procedure is. A lot easier to do with a personal reflective statement because a learner's writing that, so they could, when they explain how they do it, explain what that procedure is. Same for a professional discussion. It's sort of similar, but it's audio recorded rather than written. And we've got an additional assessment method, which is questioning. So questioning is, as it sounds, probably be used to this from any sort of previous education you've had, whether that's school, college or university. And that's quite simply where you write an answer to your question. The question's not used that much for SVQs. We'll go into a bit more detail about why that is. Typically questions are just used to cover the missing gaps before we close off a unit. And for some frameworks or certain units, you'll find there's assessment criteria. Assessment criteria is sort of a combination. The easiest way to think of it is a combination of performance and knowledge and understanding. It's where the unit's not actually split into the two. Now, another way to look at these assessment methods is to divide them up by sort of the point of view of where we're gathering this evidence. So we'll see that product evidence, personal reflective statements, professional discussions and questionings, they're all coming from the learner's perspective. So you as a learner, when you're producing evidence, professional discussions is something that you do with the learner, so that is evidence coming from a learner, so the learner's saying that they're doing these things. Statements is them writing a story of a time that you have completed that task. Product evidence is a record or a file, document or a screenshot that you've got because you're saying I've done this is a screenshot of me doing it, and a question's your written answer to knowledge and understanding point. So that's all evidence that's got from the learner. However, it is important to get evidence from other people's perspectives to ensure that the evidence is authentic. So we can't just take the learner's words for a whole unit. We've got to get other people's perspectives. So that's why observations, we like to do observations, they come from an assessor's point of view. So that's an assessor saying, yep, okay, I know the learner's written a statement that they've done this and I've actually seen them do it, so that learner definitely is able to perform those skills in the workplace. And witness testimony is obviously from the perspective of a manager or a mentor, and it's great to combine the three different perspectives when we're gathering evidence for a unit, because if you've got a unit and you've got an observation in there, you've got a statement, and you've got some witness testimony, that is where the learner's saying, so use the learner saying, I've been able to do this, it's backed up by an assessor saying you're doing it, and your manager's also been able to say you've done it over a period of time as well, which proves beyond, anyone's doubt, absolutely proves that you're able to perform that, and that's what this SVQ is all about. It's about putting together that portfolio of evidence that proves that you're competent in your role. So let's talk about triangulation. So that's a bit of a technical term, a bit of jargon there, for a concept that's quite easy to understand, but it's important when it comes to SVQs and vocational training. So triangulation can be one or two things. It's mostly about combining different types of evidence. So if you think about it, all evidence that we want to gather for your SVQ is what's called task orientated. It should be focused more so on the task. It's not really necessarily about the unit. So you want to focus on a task. So maybe let's have an example. You're working in a finance office and you need to input invoices onto the finance software. So that would be your task. And you'd maybe want to write up a personal reflective statement for that task. You could also take screenshots of you uploading that invoice, getting it in an email maybe, saving it in the right place. You've got a screenshot of you typing it into the finance software and then attaching the PDF onto the record, searching up the customer's record on that system as well maybe. So you could have a number of screenshots, which is product evidence. And then on your personal reflective statement, you could have a brief bit of witness testimony where your line managers said, I can confirm that this personal reflective statement is authentic and I've been able to see them do this task. And that way you've got a bit of evidence that actually has three different types of assessment methods on there, and that's really good because that strengthens the evidence, because you're getting different types to back it up. It's the one task and you've got different types of, you've used different assessment methods to gather your evidence, so it's really, really strong evidence. So that's what it means when we've got really, really strong evidence. And another example of this would maybe be a time you're completing a task and there's an observation. So it could maybe be the same task, it could be a different task, it doesn't matter. So say this task is about adding new accounts onto the system. You could have an assessor watching you do that and completing that task, and while you're doing that task, the assessor may ask you about what it is you're doing, why is it you're doing that, and they can then record that as a professional discussion as well. And that is the one task that you're doing, and you're getting both an observation and a professional discussion. So it's two assessment methods. That makes it a lot stronger than just having the one. The other form of triangulation is what we're talking about just there, about different people's perspectives. So within a unit, you're wanting to have ideally evidence from three different persons' perspectives. So that is an assessor doing your observation, your line manager doing your witness testimony, and any of the assessment methods which focus in on the learner. So a personal reflective statement or a discussion, product evidence, that sort of thing. So you're wanting both forms of triangulation to have really, really strong evidence and an absolutely brilliant portfolio. Okay, so now we're going to look at holistic assessments. So this is another key concept when it comes to assessing and putting together your portfolio of evidence. So all of your evidence should be holistic, and again, that's another bit of jargon there, but it relates to a very, very simple concept, and that is that all of your assessments, all of your statements that you're doing should be task orientated. So this is where the evidence focuses in on the task you're completing, not necessarily the unit. You can obviously go too far the other way, where you're writing about stuff that's not very relevant to any of the units you're doing, and therefore it's not very useful as evidence. But you also don't want to go too far focusing on completing units and the criteria. What you really want to be doing is writing a story. So let's say it's a personal reflective statement. You're writing a story of a time that you've completed that task. So you're writing about that task. what you really want to be doing is focusing in on a unit, but you want to be telling me all about that task. So let's say you're putting together a PowerPoint, for example. You don't want to just write about that PowerPoint itself. You don't want to start by saying, I opened up Microsoft PowerPoint, I clicked a new slide and taking it from there. You want to start from the very beginning of that task, because there might be other aspects of it. How did you know you had to do the task? What was the task? Talk about the communication around it. Talk about the various aspects of it. And then that way you'll find that that evidence will start to go into different units. So if you're focusing on the task, evidence in the workplace, you're not going to be just doing tasks that's around units naturally in the workplace. You're going to be doing tasks that's important for your business, and those tasks will fall into different units. So for example, if we talk about the previous example that I've given, where you are uploading an invoice onto some finance software, you'll find that that will cover perhaps your accountancy software unit. If you're communicating with the person that sent that invoice, you'll start to look at that falls into maybe a unit that covers communication. You might find that it starts to cover units around customer service. If you are setting people's deadlines, meeting people's deadlines that they've given you for the work, or communicating with them and giving them good customer service. Could also cover, if you're pulling a report, if after you do that task, part of that task is running a report and doing a reconciliation, then if you're doing a report, that might fit into a unit such as analyze report data. But that's the one task. So if your one task is confirming with a customer what they need to be done, you're then processing that on the system and you're running a report and doing reconciliation. That can fit into 4 or 5 units if you're making it task orientated. So that's the idea behind holistic statements. So you're writing a statement on the one task, and you'll find that it falls in not just the unit one that you're focusing on, but it will fall into a number of different units. Might even fall into your core skill and your enhancement unit. And that's really good because first of all, that evidence is really authentic because it's exactly what you're doing as part of your job. You could read that out with the context of an SVQ and really understand what it is you're doing as part of your job. And it also cuts down on the amount you have to write. If you write your statements this way, when it comes to completing your final couple of units, you'll find that a lot of the evidence will already be in those units, and it'll only be a case of filling in the gaps rather than tackling the unit as a whole. So this brings us on to learning and assessment plans. So learning assessment plans take many different formats. There's no one set way of doing it. But the idea behind a learning assessment plan is to help you as a learner be able to complete and gather evidence which is holistic and task orientated. So it's the step between looking at a unit and getting a task and combining them together. So that is where your assessor will ask you questions about what you're doing in your workplace. So what new tasks have you been working on? What is it you're currently doing? Okay, so let's say you're doing the first example there we've used already, the finance software. They'll ask you what you're doing. They'll ask you what point you start at. What do you have to do? You have to communicate with the customer. You put it onto you process it all on the system. You run a report. You send that report on to someone else, so you save it in a certain place, and they'll sort of talk you through the various points in that task you want to cover and how that aligns to your units as well, to help you out to plan out how you're going to do an assessment. That's really all what learning assessment plans are. It's if that point's missing, then what will happen is you'll just be given a unit guide for a unit, and that's quite difficult as a learner who doesn't really, if you don't really know the standards, that can be quite intimidating. So what you want to do is get this learning assessment plan where the assessor's basically going through the unit and saying, right, okay, this task will cover all these points. So this is sort of what I want you to write about, and that way you don't have to focus so much on the units, because you don't really, as a new learner, you're not really going to know the units that well, but you will know your job well because that's what you do day in day out, and it's about aligning the tasks that you're doing. The learning assessment plan simply aligns tasks that you do with the units, so you know what you're doing when it comes to gathering evidence. And you do that by focusing on the task, choosing the best assessment method for that, and picking dates for when those assessments are going to be carried out. And it helps us as part of a guideline as well, so you don't go too further away. If you were just writing a statement, if you're just told to write a statement on a task you do as part of your job, you could be writing about anything. You might go way off tangent, and it's not much use for evidence, so it can go the other way. And that doing this allows assessor and the learner to set some guidelines so that what you're writing is useful for your SVQ. So let's talk a bit about the standards and to what standard evidence has to be. This is an absolutely brilliant metaphor. So what we want is we don't want a really rubbish, really poor drawing here. We want an absolute work of art. We want you as a learner to put in as much effort as you can to get this really realistically what it is you do as part of your job. So you want to put in a good amount of detail in this when it comes to doing statements. We really want a lot of detail, exactly what you do, step-by-step instructions, that sort of thing. When we do observations and witness testimony, we want it to be on the stuff that you regularly do, but some of the more advanced stuff that you regularly do, we don't want it to have it all on just kind of easy, straightforward, basic stuff. We want to really know what your role's all about and the tasks that you complete. So you want to be completing this portfolio to high standard as you can. Now, in terms of what it's actually marked against, maybe mark's not the best term or phrase for this, but it's assessed a bit different. So what happens is you'll gather some evidence and you'll submit it to your assessor. Assessor will then make an assessment decision, so they'll decide whether that evidence meets the standard of the framework or not. And how they do that is they look at these 4 things here. So they'll decide whether this evidence is authentic. So authentic means it should be beyond doubt that the evidence is the work of the learner. So how would an assessor do that? They'd make sure that it's your work, that you've maybe signed and dated the evidence. They'll be able to see from any files or documents before that you're maybe the author of the document, that it's your manager that's done the testimony, not someone that they've maybe not heard of. And if you're doing witness testimony, you've got a contributors list or witness testimony list recording maybe the names and the contact details of who's giving you the witness testimony, so it could be followed up with if there's any questions about it, so we know that is actually somebody that works in your organisation. So all these sorts of things will make evidence more authentic. Okay, sufficient is about, is there enough evidence for the assessor to make a judgment based on that evidence you've submitted that you're able to perform this skill in the workplace. So that often comes out when you write a personal reflective statement and maybe there's not enough detail in it, maybe it's too short, too focused, in which case there's not enough there. The assessor can only make a judgment on the evidence that's been produced. They can't make a judgment on anything else that they've seen. It's just what evidence they have in front of them, and if there's not enough there, might be that they can't actually make that decision. You might have to say, actually, this isn't enough yet to say that you can perform that task. You'll maybe have to expand on it or add to it. Reliable. So reliable means that there's consistent performance over a period of time and in different contexts and situations. So when it comes to an SVQ, when you cover each point within a unit, we don't want it to be the exact same time you've completed that task. So I know we said about using different forms of evidence to strengthen that point, but you also want to have maybe another time where you've completed that task, and that will show that you are able to perform these skills over a period of time. There isn't much value in being able to say, I performed this task once. It's not much use. An SVQ is about certifying and saying this person's competent to perform this role, and it takes more than just completing a task once to be able to be competent. That's why experience is important. So it's important for an SVQ to be able to document that you have been able to perform that task over a period of time, and that's what reliable means. Witness testimony is probably the best form of evidence for being able to get that you have performed that task over a period of time, because your manager can say, your assessor doing an observation, they'll see you whenever they're doing a review, maybe every 10 weeks. But your manager's there every day and they can say, oh yeah, I've seen the learner do this, yourself do this many times over the past 3-4 months. And current means that the evidence should show up-to-date knowledge, understanding, skills, performance. So it's not stuff that's outdated that you know about. It's your knowledge, your understanding, the task you can perform is current, relevant to your role, up to date. It's not how the task was completed 10-15 years ago. It is good high quality skills that is up to date. An important note on assessment decisions is that this qualification, or any vocational qualification, isn't pass or fail. So that's another difference from other forms of education. It's not pass or fail, it's competent or not yet competent. So if at any point you don't pass an assessment, or your assessor says it's not quite a pass at this point, you need to do make some changes, we need to see this again, there wasn't enough in that assessment for them to make that decision. It's not a fail, it's not a pass, it's competent or not yet competent. So if you're, a simpler case, you're not yet competent, but we'll give it a wee bit of time. Maybe we'll speak with your mentor, your line manager, and say, look, is there other times where you could get involved in this task to get your competence up to the required level, and then maybe 3 months down the line, the assessment will do assessment again on that task, and hopefully by that point you'll be competent. So it's not pass or fail. If you aren't able to do it the first time round, it's not the end of the world. Simply do it again in a couple of months once you've had another couple of 8 months of experience performing that task. Okay. So knowledge and understanding. Take a wee minute now to talk about knowledge and understanding within an SVQ. Mentioned a little bit about this before, but it's a bit different to, like I said, you're used to maybe coming from college, coming from school, where you're given either an exam or an essay to do, or a set of questions. And in that context, when you're writing an answer for anything, you'll probably be talking about defining what that concept is, talking about maybe a theory, maybe talking about different situations where that could apply, but it's very hypothetical. It's very, very sort of hypothetical. It could apply in any situation. It's important that any knowledge and understanding within an SVQ is done within the context of your workplace. So what that means is that knowledge and understanding has got to be relevant to your role. Can't be something that you've just come up with or you've looked up online. It may be the case you might want to do a bit of research for knowledge and understanding online, but it must always be related to your role. Okay, so assessment should be carried out during the performance to ensure integration of theory and practice. So what that means is the best way to get your knowledge and understanding is to do it when you're performing the task. So if you're writing a personal statement and it's talking about your procedures, the performance point is asking you to perform, keep information secure, and the knowledge point is what are your organisation's security procedures and policies. Then if you were to write in your statement how you did it, but also what your policies and procedures are, that's placing that knowledge and understanding within the context of your role, and that's what we're looking for. To avoid repetition, any knowledge points which aren't covered in performance, so you're doing an observation, you're doing a personal reflective statement, they can be covered in a focused piece of work, and what that means is basically a list of questions. It's not good practice though to just provide you with a list of questions for the whole unit. We want to get as much as we can out of the performance assessment methods, and it's a case of filling in the gaps with a focused document that's got all the remaining questions that's not been covered. Okay, so yeah, candidates should be able to apply knowledge and understanding within the context of units, and the learner must show an understanding of the knowledge points. Learners should explain how they would use that knowledge in their job role. So if you're writing a focused piece of work and you're answering that question, very, very important that you explain how they would use that knowledge in your role. So why is that point relevant? So you use a lot of workplace examples if you're doing it that way. So yeah, candidates should provide specific example from their work practice where they've actually applied that knowledge in the workplace. That's the key. It's about applying that knowledge in the workplace. It's not just about you know it. You want to be able to say, I know this is what it is, and this is how I applied that knowledge in the workplace. This is why it's important I know that. Candidates should, I think that's a repetition point there, candidates should demonstrate knowledge and understanding in the context of units. And like I said, workbooks, set lists or scenarios for reflection aren't really saying they're not acceptable. It's not best practice, not a good idea to give you a big list of all the questions for the units. It's important that you first try and get those knowledge points covered from your performance, because if it's just a big list of questions, it's very difficult for you to consistently make that relevant to your role, and it's probably a bit of repetition because you've probably actually done that in some other form of evidence. So you might have done that task. So instead of writing a question, you're saying, when I was saving files on my computer, I followed the information management procedure to keep it secure and confidential. So rather than writing a question about that, you probably did an observation where you did that task, or you probably wrote a statement where you're doing that task. Instead of having it on a separate document and repeating yourself, just integrate it and cover it when you're doing the performance point. Okay, so personal reflective statements. Personal reflective statements are simply a story of a time where you've completed this task. So at this point, we're just going through the remaining performance assessment methods that we've got. So we're just going through all the assessment methods. So we'll start with personal reflective statements, a story of a time where you've completed this task. It's quite straightforward. You'll agree this with your assessor before you start. what the task is you're going to write about, and you just write about that task. So you want to, in a statement, you want to explain what it is you're doing. You also want to have a reflective account and say why you're doing it. You want to storyboard this statement with images and screenshots and write it within the STAR method. So what does that all mean? So STAR method: situation, task, action, result. Always start your personal reflective statements with time. So when was it you were doing it? What was the situation? What was it you're doing? What was the task that you actually had to complete? When was it due? How did you have to do it? What software did you use to do it? What people did you need to involve yourself with? That sort of thing. Actions, the main part of it, that's where you're going through it in step-by-step instructions outlining exactly each step that you took. And this is the point where you storyboard it with images, so you get a lot of screenshots, scanned documents, whatever product evidence you can get, and have that throughout your statement to back up what you're writing. And that's brilliant because it can help cut down the amount you have to write, because you can just refer to the image. And then on the end, a little bit of reflection. What did you learn from it? What was the outcome? What did you gain from that? Personal reflective statement should be task orientated, so they should be focused on a particular task that you're doing. Don't want to see lots of different little statements. We want to see a big statement, usually, number of big statements that's focused on tasks that you complete and fall into a number of units. Don't want you to be focused on a unit and just answering one point here and there. Should be holistic, which we spoke about earlier. There's an overlap with product evidence. So if you think about product evidence being images, screenshots, documents and files which you've produced, there is a bit of an overlap here when you're using the screenshots, but that's where we're combining the different forms of evidence together. Definitely should be focused on a time where you're performing that task in the workplace. It can't be theoretical. It can't be, for example, I would do this. It must be a time where you've actually performed that task. Very important. Must be you've actually done this, because you're gathering evidence, you're gathering a portfolio of evidence that proves you're competent at your job. And the way this statement falls into that by saying, I have done this, this is a time where I've done it, and this is how I went about doing it. Okay, and on the end you should reflect on what you've gained from that experience. Okay. The next type is product evidence. So product evidence is physical evidence of you being able to perform those skills in the workplace. Okay, maybe use a wee example here. You know, if you were doing a woodwork apprenticeship, product evidence would be like a bench that you've made, for example, or a bit of furniture that you've made. If you're doing a sort of business type office-based apprenticeship, the sorts of things which you produce are documents, and we've got a number of examples here which we can go through. So examples will include emails where you've provided feedback, or emails of any kind. In fact, any sort of digital communication, written communication, whether they be text messages on a collaborative technology such as Microsoft Teams, Trello, Jabber, Cisco Jabber, any sort of instant messaging platform that you might use for your job. Any sort of digital communication at all can be screenshotted and used. Documents such as personal development plans, any sort of file like a PowerPoint presentation, Words, Excel, PDF documents, they can all be used. You've got letters, minutes of meetings, maybe not used as much more, but certainly in particular industries, if you work in an industry where that's important, you can use minutes of meetings, forms and screenshots as well. So screenshots is useful if you're using a database system, and you can take a screenshot of the page and have that in there. It's obviously important when it comes to product evidence not to include anything that's confidential in your product evidence, and there's ways to get around that. The easiest way to do that would be to take your screenshot, to save it somewhere, maybe in a folder for all your apprenticeship work. If you open it in Paint, if you're using Microsoft operating system, if you open it in Paint, you can create a black box, and once you save it, you can't move that black box, so you can block out and cover any confidential information. It's important that we don't include any confidential information in the evidence you're producing. But that being said, we want to see as much of this product evidence as possible, and if you start with the screenshots, it's great because it's easy to write your statement around those. Product evidence is really used in isolation, so what that means is, really, will you get just a screenshot of something and say, there's my evidence? Most of the time you want to combine it with another form of evidence, and most commonly that will be personal reflective statements that you'll combine that with. All product evidence needs to be authenticated, so what that means is that you can't just have a screenshot on its own. You need to have it signed and dated, or some sort of way of having it dated, and you also have to have maybe a little statement on there saying what that evidence is, because that screenshot on its own doesn't say anything, doesn't mean anything. You've got to put a wee statement on there saying this is a screenshot of me typing up and processing an invoice onto the customer's accountancy software. The screenshot on its own doesn't mean anything, and that can be done. The old sort of way was printing it off and writing it on it, but you could just create maybe a Word document, put that screenshot in there, and type that brief statement on the bottom as a way of authenticating. Questioning. So questioning we've talked about a little bit already. Fairly straightforward. You'll be used to this from school. It fills gaps in knowledge and understanding. It's used to clarify something. Discover how the learner would have dealt with an unforeseen event. It could be hypothetical stuff for maybe questioning. You know, if something came up, that if something else happened when you're doing this task, what would you do? Knowledge and understanding should be linked to learner's performance. It should always have context, so that's what I'm saying. It's linked to performance, linked to what you're doing as part of your role. There's many different types of questions out there. Always pay attention to the first word in a question, because that tells you how you're going to structure your answer. Knowledge can be assessed from performance, which we've already talked about, and if it's not covered, then we'll start to look at questioning. Observation. So observation is where an assessor observes and actually sees a learner performing skills in the workplace, and because of this, it is the most valid and authentic form of evidence. There's no way around about it. You've got an independent, you've got an assessor coming in there, not your employer, not someone that works with you, someone external coming in and seeing that you can actually do that task. So it's the best form of evidence. It's really great from a learner's point of view as well, so from your point of view, because you don't have to do anything extra. You just have to perform that task when your assessor's there, and that counts as evidence, so it's absolutely brilliant. You may also include any work product produced. So if we're doing an observation and you're creating a document, might use that document and add it to the observation record, and that is a way of sort of adding in additional, triangulating and adding in additional evidence. It may include discussion and questions. So when you're doing an observation, your assessor might ask you, why is it you're doing that? What would you do if this happened? And that way you're also combining different forms of evidence into the one assessment to cover that one task that you're doing. Observations typically are recorded either by an audio recording or they could be written. So that means if it's written, the assessor will make some notes and then they'll type up a written record of what you did during the observation. Or if it's audio recorded, it'll just be the assessor recording verbally them saying the things that you were doing while you're performing that observation. Professional discussions. So professional discussions are an audio recorded discussion between the assessor and the learner. It's usually focused on previously submitted evidence, so it might be where you get evidence you submitted previously and it's just a discussion. They're fairly unstructured. It's a bit of a chat around previous evidence you submitted, talk maybe about hypotheticals at that point, explain your reasoning for doing certain things. And it's really good for assessing higher order analytical skills to show that you really understand what it is that you've been doing. So it's not just you can perform it, but you actually know the reasons why you're doing it. A lot of time it can be combined with an observation, or it could be done on its own. Professional discussions are also useful for adding annotation to product evidence. So if you've got a document or a file where you haven't written that annotation on it, we can use a discussion and verbally record that annotation and combine it with the product evidence to authenticate it. And the last thing that product evidence is really good for is confidential information. So depending on the industry and the workplace that you're in, you might have a lot of confidential information around where it can be very difficult to get product evidence. And if that's the case, we'll use a discussion to get around that. And how we do that is we'll have a review or assessment visit. You can bring that confidential information to the visit, and we'll start the audio recording. We'll do a discussion where you will talk about what that evidence is, explain what it is, how it's put together, what you contributed towards it, but you wouldn't read out anything confidential. You wouldn't start reading out bank details, financial information, dates, contact information, that sort of thing. You wouldn't be reading out you'd just be talking in a sort of general terms what that is and what you did to contribute towards it. That confidential information, that confidential document would never leave your workplace. It's just that audio recording that would then be added to your portfolio. So it can also be useful if you have any product evidence you want to use and it's confidential. You should contact your assessor and plenty of time before your assessment to let them know that, and they can do a discussion to get that evidence into your portfolio. Witness testimony. Witness testimony is excellent evidence. It's great supporting evidence. So what that means is it supports what you've written in a personal reflective statement. It supports what's been seen in an observation. There's observation, they happen fairly infrequently. The assessor's only going to see you once every maybe 10 weeks, but your manager, your mentor, they're there every day. So it's great for them to confirm that it's not just that one occasion you've been able to perform that skill, you've been able to do that over a long period of time. Witnesses should be able to observe the learner perform the tasks frequently, so it can't just be someone you've just met like 2 or 3 days beforehand. Ideally someone who's known you for a period of time when you've been in the workplace. They should be experienced and competent, so they can't just be your best pal who you sit next to, or maybe another learner that you've joined about the same time. They've got to be someone who is experienced and competent to be able to say whether and judge whether you are good at performing that task. Witnesses can annotate evidence to authenticate it's the learner's work. So that would be where you write a personal reflective statement and the witness can annotate it, add a wee signature and say, I can confirm that that is something which you do in the workplace. It's good practice to include a contributors list or a witness testimony list. So that is where you've got a list of all the people who have contributed towards your portfolio, such as people who are doing witness testimony, just a table where you've got their name and maybe their contact details and what evidence or what they helped contribute towards your portfolio. Witness testimony can be used to maintain confidentiality. So in a similar way as discussions, they're not reading out the confidential information, but they're saying what you did to contribute towards it without actually using that confidential information. And witness testimony is excellent for recording performance over time as well, because when you write a statement, you're writing about that one time you've done it, but having testimony, your manager, we can ask them, how often have you seen yourself perform that task, and we can evidence that. We've got assignments. So assignments, typically these are problem solving exercises where there's clear guidelines and you apply practical skills. It can be workplace based, could be simulated as well. Simulation is another form of evidence. We're not going to go through all, there's lots and lots of different forms of assessment methods. We're going to focus on the main ones. Could be simulated, so typically if you go into a classroom workshop on an SVQ, how those are designed is where you will be shown how to perform a task, probably a new task, maybe around using a certain bit of software, something like that, and then you will then go and perform that task on the computers. You'll be given a little scenario to complete, and you'd go and complete that task on the computer, and you'd then take screenshots of you doing it and put together something that's very similar to a personal statement on that, and that can be used as evidence towards your portfolio, as well as you actually being able to learn those skills that you've gotten from that classroom workshop, and typically that would be classed as an assignment. Recognise prior learning. So this is the last assessment method that we're going to go over. So RPL, or recognised prior learning. So this is where we recognise previously completed learning as evidence towards your current qualification. A lot of time this will come in for core skills. So if you've done a qualification in Scotland, high school or college, chances are you've got some core skills already. You might not necessarily have all of the ones that you require, but you might have some of them. You can always check this, it's on the last page of your SQA documents. However, when you meet your assessor for one of your first visits, they will be able to check on SQA's system what core skills you've got, and if you've already got the ones you need for your qualification, we can RPL it so you don't have to complete that. So if you've already got your core skills at the level required for your qualification, you don't have to do them again, we can RPL it. Some SVQ units can be RPL'd as part of an HNC. So if you've done an HNC before and the units are you complete SVQ units as part of that, those can be RPL'd as well, and that's something that can be discussed during your initial assessment. So I hope this helps in explaining the different forms of assessment methods and how they're all put together and what they sort of mean.